Heart to Heart, a Catholic media ministry, presents Good News Today, featuring an inspiring gospel teaching by Father Jim Willig.
A reading from the Holy Gospel according to Mark. In the course of his teaching, Jesus said to the crowds, "Beware of the scribes who like to go around in long robes and accept greetings in the marketplaces, seats of honor in synagogues, and places of honor at banquets. They devour the houses of widows and, as a pretext, recite lengthy prayers. They will receive a very severe condemnation." He sat down opposite the treasury and observed how the crowd put money into the treasury. Many rich people put in large sums. A poor widow also came and put in 2 small coins worth a few cents. Calling his disciples to himself, he said to them, "Amen, I say to you, this poor widow put in more than all the other contributors to the treasury, for they have all contributed from their surplus wealth. But she, from her poverty, has contributed all she had, her whole livelihood." The Gospel of the Lord.
When I first read this Gospel of the poor widow, I was reminded of a cute little story I heard recently about another poor widow who was asleep in her apartment one night when a burglar broke in and alarmed her. He came up to her as she was awakened by the noise and with a gun pointing at her said, "Lady, don't move, don't make any noise, and you won't get hurt. I'm just here looking for money." Well, the very poor elderly widow laughed. She said, "Looking for money here? Well, then let me turn the light on and look with you." Our gospel today has 2 parts to it. Perhaps we could divide our commentary accordingly. The first part is about the proud scribes, who are the antithesis of the humble poor widow that we will look at secondarily. First, Jesus brings our attention to the scribes who would have been congregating around the temple area where Jesus is presently speaking. And he says to his disciples, "Be on guard against the scribes who like to parade around in their robes and accept marks of respect in public, front seats in the synagogues, and places of honor at banquets." I have to confess, this teaching makes me a little uneasy. As far as I can see, it's the priest who primarily wears the long robes, accepts the marks of respect in public, sits in the front of the church, and sits at places of honor at banquets. So I have to take a hard look at this myself. But I'm also hoping that perhaps you could see at least a little of a tendency in all of us for this type of clericalism that Jesus finds so difficulty with can also show itself in a form of elitism or egotism or narcissism that has no corner of the market among priests or the Catholic Church, but is widely seen and in any business or home or secular setting. So we would do well, I suppose, to look at these charges that Jesus brings against the scribes, just in case there's a little scribe hiding inside of us. First, Jesus says, he finds fault in the fact that they, quote, like to parade around. Now, the emphasis there is parading around in long, flowing robes. These long robes were sometimes sweeping on the ground, much like the train of a bride's dress, to be a sign of great honor and respect, obviously drawing attention to themselves as if they're some kind of royalty. And so we would do well to ask ourselves in the mirror of this gospel, what do we do? How do we carry ourselves that draws attention to ourselves rather than giving attention to the Lord in the temple, in the church, or giving our attention to others? The scribes, very humanly and naturally, loved to be greeted with honor and respect in public. Well, don't we all? Don't we all? And yet the sign of a real saint is not that they make themselves look so good as they will make the other even look better. And so, again, Jesus is calling us to turn it around, conversion, to see that we're not about puffing up ourselves. In fact, it's the opposite. We're to be self-effacing, which is why he had such difficulty with these scribes, who also liked to sit in the front seats in a synagogue. Now, in the synagogue, I learned that they had the front wall where the Ark of the Covenant was kept, much like behind this curtain. In fact, there was a curtain there where the Torah was kept, not unlike our tabernacle in many churches. And there was the Torah, the first 5 books of the Bible, kept in a scroll that was the very sign of the Lord's presence. Well, they had against that wall a bench where the distinguished dignitaries would sit, facing the congregation. And evidently, many of them liked to be on, quote, stage, looking out to an admiring congregation. This is what really got to Jesus, because it missed the focus on the Lord. And you see, Jesus was always pointing us to focus on the Father. And that's why we can so often get in the way of God, even with our best intentions. We all do that. And finally, Jesus finds fault with the scribes because they are always taking the places of honor at banquets. Banquets, not unlike wedding banquets today, have certain seats of honor. In all these cases I said earlier, I'm embarrassed to say, usually it's the priest today who's asked to sit next to the bride and groom at banquets. I've sat there often thinking, I really should be at the end of the line. You know, sometimes people like to put us up there. And I think the more they like to do that, the harder the temptation will be for us to take the lower place. But not to think of that in such simple physical choreography of a room. It's more important that we see this as an outward sign of an inward disposition. And that's what Jesus is getting at. And so I like to just say that there is nothing so terrible about any one of the things Jesus is finding fault with, so much as it all seems to represent how the scribes had a certain spirit that was corrupt with pride and arrogance. And Jesus was calling his disciples to be about something that was the antithesis of that, which is to say humble service. That is the very heart and soul of worship and religion. And what infuriated Jesus even more was evidently the fact, as we hear at the last part of this first half of the gospel, that these very religious leaders, in the, quote, name of religion, devoured the savings of widows and would recite long prayers for appearance sake. It is they, Jesus says, who will receive the severest sentence. If there's anyone who stood up for the poor and the the voiceless in society, it was Jesus. And somehow, sometimes, it is the most sacrilegious thing that religion takes advantage of these very poor people. I know we could all see some signs of that even today. I won't go into any example because the most important thing is we first look within ourselves. And perhaps more importantly, that we look to what Jesus focused his attention on, the poor widow. And now that Jesus, in a way, set the stage for what Mark will now bring our attention to in the second half of the gospel, as Jesus finishes this hard teaching on the temple against clericalism and religious abuse, he then observes this poor widow who stands in stark contrast to the scribes. Don't miss this point, that Mark the evangelist is intending this juxtaposition of the comparison of the self-serving scribes on the one hand, now to be compared to the self-sacrificing widow on the other. He intends this to be a powerful lesson on religion. For recall, teaching is taking place at the temple, which was at the very heart of the religion of Judaism. And not unlike Jesus would want to speak here at the cathedral, the center of the archdiocesan worship also. We are told that Jesus observed the crowd putting money into the collection box. I have to just comment, that very thought amuses me, that Jesus was watching who and what people were putting into the collection. He said many of the wealthy put in sizable amounts, but one poor widow came and put in 2 small copper coins worth about a cent. Now notice, Jesus does not discourage the wealthy from putting in sizable amounts. But what caught Jesus' attention and admiration was the poor widow. Now, I often think of it when I see different plaques in church today. So-and-so gave this for so-and-so this. And I wonder if that's in the spirit of this gospel, because these poor widows who give even more generously are hardly mentioned because, they're not special friends or contributors, because they can't give in dollars what measures even a more generous proportion of their income. A little about this poor widow. First, in Jesus' time, the words poor and widow went together, like 2 sides of the same coin. Widow was that person who not only was without husband, but without a major source of income in a day when there was no social security or pension plan. So, with their very meager resources, a widow's concern was simply how she was going to make it from day to day in a matter of survival. The 2 small copper coins that she gives into the collection were the smallest of all the coins used in the currency of Jesus' time. Scholars today believe that in today's economy, those 2 small copper coins would be equivalent to 2 quarters. Jesus called his disciples over when he noticed this widow's contribution and told them, I want you to observe this poor widow who contributed more than all the others who donated to the treasury. They gave from their surplus wealth, but she gave from her want all that she had to live on. Isn't that a beautiful line? She gave all that she had to live on. You can see that Jesus wanted his disciples to not miss this lesson of what it means to give to God all that we have to live on, and how few of us have that generosity of heart to give over all that we would otherwise hold onto ourselves. I would suggest that we could spell this widow's mite, M-I-T-E, as M-I-G-H-T. For this widow certainly exemplifies a mighty trust in God as she invests her savings, herself, completely into trusting in the generosity of the Lord. When Jesus saw it, it must have so inspired him. He immediately called his disciples and said, "You've got to see this." You know how it is when we see something that inspires us and we tell our friends, "You've got to see this. You've got to hear this. Look at this widow. This is a living parable, what I've been trying to teach you all along." Jesus wanted his disciples to see such a beautiful example of the gospel, of giving and serving and sacrificing. That's what it's all about. I was reminded too of another cute little joke I heard. Speaking of contributions, there was a discussion among a $50 bill, a $20 bill, and a single dollar bill about which one of them was more important. Well, the $50 bill obviously spoke up first, saying, "What's the problem? It's a matter of simple arithmetic. Figure it out for yourselves. I'm worth more than both of you guys put together." Well, the $20 bill argued the point, saying, "Yes, but it all depends on what you value most, according to what's more valuable. I happen to value being with common people. And I'm with people when they take me to the restaurants, to the movie theaters, to the sporting events. I'm with the common people, and I love it. I'm more valuable." The single dollar bill was very silent for a while, but then spoke up, "You've got a point. It all depends on what you value. And remember how we've all written across our face, 'In God we trust'? Well, I personally value religion. I myself am in church every single Sunday in a collection, but I never see either you guys there." A little observation about Jesus' observation. Isn't it interesting to look at who Jesus admired, the type of people he admired? It is not the kind of people that his society highlighted or esteemed, nor do we today. The people Jesus admired were not the rich and famous, the movers and the shakers, nor even the religious leaders, not to mention athletes or entertainers. The type of people Jesus admired always seemed to be the simple, humble people, right? Even as we read the gospel, recall just a couple weeks ago when Jesus wanted to make a point with the Pharisees, he brought a little child before them who counted for nothing in the status-conscious society of Jesus' day and age. Or remember Jesus bringing the blind man who would have been the handicapped person. People would have been blind to even seeing him as a beggar along the street. Somehow Jesus saw in these little people a great example of what we must be. And if that is the case, I wonder who Jesus would admire in our churches today. I wonder who he would point out as the living parable of this gospel, people we would find as an inspiration for our life, needing to look at them as a way of learning the lesson that Jesus wants to teach us. You know, I really believe that there is no better way of learning a lesson than by the inspiring people the Lord places in our lives. Who are these people Jesus would admire? I asked myself that same question last Sunday, knowing that this coming Sunday would be this gospel of the poor widow, as I sat in the front of church in my long robes. I looked out at our people and observed them, not as they were putting into the collection basket, but just as we were praying together. And I became conscious of a beautiful widow in our cathedral parish. My attention and admiration has been drawn to her, not just this Sunday, but many times, as a living example of a living saint among us. Someone who I would like to share is the greatest example I find around me presently that portrays the widow in the gospel today. I'm speaking of Mrs. Stratton, who was born in 1907 and lived for most of her life in the West End, not too far from here, in the Laurel Homes housing project. She was happily married and lived here with her husband in Cincinnati, but her husband died at a very young age in 1957. They couldn't have any children by themselves, but shortly after her husband died, her sister-in-law also died and left 2 young boys whom Mrs. Stratton adopted and raised herself, sending them all the way through Elder High School, which is no small thing given her income. In order to support herself and them, she worked as the housekeeper at St. Joseph's Church in the West End. Her full-time salary was $40 a week. That's $1 an hour. Yet still, she told me she gave to the church $2 every single Sunday. My friends, that's tithing 5% of her income. She said she never had any extra money to be any kind of savings in the bank, but the Lord provided for her needs. Not only did she tithe her money, she tithed even more of her time as she volunteered as a sacristan in the church and as a bingo worker for more than 36 some years. Can you talk about greater love than this? No one has. In fact, that's where I first met her. I was the associate pastor at St. Joseph's Parish, where she was, and we would work bingo together every Saturday night. And I would always cry on her shoulders, "I hate bingo!" And she would say, "Oh, Father, it isn't that bad." And she's been working 36 years at this, And it would just drive me crazy. And I think it was then that she began to pray for me. She told me just recently that she adopted all of us priests at the parish as her children and prayed for us every single day, even to this day. I didn't realize that. I was so touched by this woman's heart that was so large to hold us as her sons and hold us in prayer each day. That is great love. In 1968, Mrs. Stratton had breast cancer. Several years later, had colon cancer, but nothing stopped her from giving of herself to the church, and she still made her way to walking to church at least twice a week, every Friday and Sunday. And every week, when she comes, immediately following the service, she walks through the pews and puts all the books back in the rack, picks up all the paper fallen on the floor, and, no small thing, makes sure there's still enough toilet paper in the restroom. That is humble service, isn't it? A few weeks ago, Mrs. Stratton had her purse stolen here in church. and with it, her church envelope that was always there, and she still to this day tithes. And interestingly, it was just 1 week later, she was in church walking through the pews, cleaning them, when she found on the floor a $100 bill, which she gave immediately to the pastor, who insisted that she found it, she should keep it. I myself would have seen it as a sign from God. He wanted me to have this. But in her wonderful generosity said, it belongs to the Lord. And you see how those words describe the poor widow in Jesus' life and what is expected of all of us who give the Lord all ourselves. It all belongs to the Lord. It's just that we figure out how much the Lord wants to share with us and share with others. It's that mentality and generosity we want to emulate. I guess the question for all of us is, well, who do you admire? And who is it that inspires you? Look to the simple, humble people around you. You may even be surprised. It could be somebody in your own household, among your own family. We're not talking about perfect people. Remember, saints are not perfect. They just try harder to do what the Lord asks. Amen.
Heart to Heart welcomes you back next week for another inspiring edition of Good News Today. If you are interested in other books, CDs, DVDs, or digital downloads by Father Jim or Father Michael, you can call toll-free 1-877-208-4875 or visit our website, www.heartoheart.org. There, you can also sign up to receive a weekly reminder to listen to these same programs online. And please, consider a donation of any size to help support Heart to Heart's radio and internet ministry. That's www.heartoheart.org or call 1-877-208-4875. Thank you for listening, and may God bless your heart and the hearts of all of your loved ones.
Heart to heart, hand in hand, praying for grace to understand. Spirit of Jesus, open our hearts to live and to love the gospel.